by Frank Riley. Brevity was the new watchword. Walter von Königsberg woke up a few moments after the Earth shuttle had passed Venus. As he gazed back at the lonely, shrouded planet abandoned long ago when man won freedom to colonize more habitable worlds in deep space, Walter realized that in just a matter of minutes his long pilgrimage would be over. Soon he would walk down the ramp and set foot on Earth, the almost mythical homeland of his people. Walter was young enough and old enough not to be ashamed of the sudden choking in his throat, the moisture in his eyes. A light touch on his shoulder brought him back to the shuttle ship. The pert stewardess smiled at his start. "Whistle, sir?" she asked pleasantly. Or at least that's what it sounded like to Walter, whose ears were still ringing from the takeoff at the Singer's Roman 3 shuttleport.
"I beg your pardon,"
he began.
"I am afraid."
For a moment she looked startled, then her full, red lips parted in another bright smile. "Oh, I'm sorry," she exclaimed. "I didn't realize."
"I just asked, sir, whether you had been sleeping."
She spoke with the mechanical, stilted perfection he had first noted when transferring from the Aldebaran liner at the shuttleport. He had wondered briefly about the source of the accent, but had been too polite to ask. The stewardess put a small pillow in his lap, then placed a tray on it. The recessed compartment of the tray held a cup of steaming black coffee, a piece of pastry that reminded Walter of a fell-strudel, and a paper-covered booklet entitled
Easy Earth Dictionary and Orientation Manual.
Stamped on the cover in the manner of an official seal were the words,
"Prepared under the authorization of Happy Time Limited."
"Thank you,"
said Walter. Then he grinned buoyantly, eager to share these moments of excitement at being so close to Earth.
"But I don't think I'll need the dictionary."
Tiny frown lines appeared between the stewardess's carefully arched eyebrows.
HSR,
she inquired uncertainly.
"I don't understand."
The stewardess managed a professional smile that was edged with just the faintest touch of impatience.
"That's what I thought. What I asked, sir, was how long since you've been on Earth. This is my first visit."
"Then you had better study the dictionary," she said firmly. "Oh no, I really don't need it." Walter's inner excitement showed in the flush of his fair Nordic complexion. He turned toward her in a burst of confidence.
"You see, my people always kept alive their native languages. My father's side of the family was German, and down through all the generations they've managed to teach the language to their children. It was the same way with my mother's family, who were English."
Pride came into his voice.
"I could speak both languages by the time I was 4. And you've never taken the shuttle from Singdis?" "I've never been on Singdis before, nor on Aldebaran VI Deneb Roman 2 or Arcturus Roman 9.
Explained Walter, naming the far-flung way station across the galaxy. He added,
"I'm on my way in from New Stas Andromeda, you know."
Respect replaced the hint of impatience in the stewardess's smile, which instantly became more personal. Not for generations had a colonist from the Andromeda galaxy boarded the shuttle. The Andromeda run to cross 1,500,000 light-years of space could be made only by special charter at a fantastic cost. This blond young man with the stubborn chin and sensitive mouth was obviously a colonial of tremendous wealth. The pilot's buzzer sounded and a red light flickered on the passenger instruction panel.
"I have to go forward now,"
the stewardess said regretfully.
"We're entering the warp, and it's time to prepare for landing. Maybe later."
She let the invitation trail off and left him with a very special smile. Walter understood the smile. He was a young man, but he was no fool. In the trading centers of Andromeda, many women smiled at him that way when they learned he was a von Königsberg from Neustadt. He dumped the pastry in the black coffee, took a generous bite, and settled back to be alone with his thoughts. An Earth woman was not an essential part of the dream that had taken him on this quixotic voyage. True, there might be a woman who would come to love him enough so that she would leave the old world culture and graciousness of Earth for the colonial life on the immense frontier of Andromeda. But being of an age where the dreams of youth are merging with practicality, Walter rather doubted he would find such a woman. He didn't doubt that the rest of his dream would come gloriously to life. While the shuttle ship whirled without motion through the voidless void of hyperspace, Wallace smiled at the prospect ahead. 6 months to immerse himself in the wonder of Earth's culture. 6 months to enjoy the whole of it instead of nourishing the few precious fragments kept alive by his family through the first centuries of colonial life in the new galaxy. Delightful evenings at the symphony and the opera. Beethoven, Verdi, Brahms, Schubert and Wagner. Perhaps he would even be able to attend a performance of Die Meistersinger. Wallace smiled to himself. His great-great-grandfather, who had first discovered the incredibly rich mines, forests and black loam of Neustadt, had started the tradition of naming the first son Walter after the whimsical Meistersinger Walther von der Vogelweide. Then there would be leisurely afternoons in the great libraries and museums. All the great classics of literature and art instead of the few faded pictures and the handful of volumes in the high-beamed library of his family castle. The infrequent ships that travelled between the fringes of the two galaxies had little room for books and art treasures. 3 years ago, on the occasion of Walter's 21st birthday, his mother had broken down in tears as she told of trying for half a decade to order a set of Goethe as a coming-of-age present for him. But after the request had finally reached Earth, some clerk had garbled the order and sent a 4-page booklet that apparently was some kind of puzzle book for children. Now he could steep himself in Goethe, Schiller, Dickens, Maupassant, Tolstoy. And best of all, the conversation. The delicate art of communicating mind with mind. What tales he would have to tell when he sat again in the family banquet hall. How his mother's eyes would sparkle. How his father would roar with delight as he recounted some rapier-like bon mot. But all this was only the small part of the dream. The small personal part. The dream itself was so much bigger, as big as a dream must be, to carry over from youth to manhood. He had first dreamed it as a boy sitting on the hearthrug with his knees tucked up under his chin, watching the great leaping fire, while behind him in the shadows his grandfather played on the old violin. Meditation, his grandfather had called it, by a long-ago composer of Earth, the man strangely named Thais. His grandfather couldn't play very much of it, but the fragment had lodged in Walter's heart and would be there to the end of his life. Walter's dream was indeed a grand dream shaped for melody and leaping flames. He would not spend his lifetime wresting more wealth from the riches of Neustadt. That had been done for him, the challenge was gone. But someday he would make the journey to Earth and bring back with him enough of the beauty and culture to make Neustadt a miniature Earth out on the rim of Andromeda. It was indeed a grand dream. He would spend his wealth for books and music and treasures of art. He would try to bring back artists and teachers to and from Neustadt, would spread the wonder of the new to old culture. It would reach out to all the colonies of the Andromeda galaxy, giving texture to life. And it would be there like a shining beacon when man made his next great step across space, across the millions of light years to the Camera galaxy and beyond. The stewardess again touched his shoulder with a gesture that was not entirely according to shuttle ship regulations. "We're through the warp and are now in orbit," she said. "We'll land at Uniport in 3 minutes. Uniport, the fabled entry port of Earth. It was the new hub, the pulsing heart of the homeland. It was the syndrome of all Earth culture, and its strataways reached out like spokes of a spidery wheel to every city of the planet. Walter's knees were a little shaky as he moved down the ramp, and the moisture in the corners of his eyes was not caused by the sleety December wind that whipped across the vast landing area. He was on Earth. He was the first of his people to return to the fatherland that had cradled them and sent them out into the universe. When the stewardess said goodbye to him at the foot of the ramp, she looked both puzzled and disappointed. Her smile had been an invitation, and she had sensed the tug of it in his answering grin. But he only tipped his hat and went on into the customs office. He felt like a small boy suddenly confronted by so many delights that he knew not which to sample first.
Destination?
The customs officer's blue pencil poised over the question on the Uniport entry form. Walter shrugged carelessly.
"Oh, I'll look around Uniport a while, then visit other cities. New York, London, Vienna. I have 6 months, you know. I'm sure you'll enjoy a happy time. But you must have a destination, some place where you can be contacted, or leave forwarding addresses."
The official's voice was patient, but it had the curious mechanical quality Walter had noted in speech of the pretty young stewardess.
Can you recommend good lodging? The Uniport landing provides excellent facilities, and you'll be among other travelers until you have a chance to adjust yourself to happy time activities. Oh no! I don't want to waste a moment. I want to live among the people of Earth from this very first night.
The customs office appeared at Walter's entry permit.
Andromeda.
That's what I thought.
He shook his head dubiously.
You have your orientation manual?
Walter fumbled in the pockets of his greatcoat.
I must have left it on the shuttle ship, but I don't need it.
The official pressed another copy of the manual firmly into Walter's hands.
It is required.
He said.
First visitors are not allowed to leave the Uniport landing without one.
Walter was too happy to argue. He shoved the manual into one of pockets.
If I may suggest, sir,
said the customs officer, his eyes widening as he looked over Walter's letters of credit.
You will find the Hotel Alta most comfortable.
It's where all important visitors in Uniport stay.
The next few moments went by so quickly they left Walter a little dazed. A server robot took his bags and led him to a monorail car which whisked him off to the hotel.
Digger,
said the doorman of the server robot in a brilliant scarlet uniform. Its wax-like features were set in a perpetual smile. Walter blinked.
I'm sorry.
He began.
There,
said the majestic robot, taking Walter's hand-jeweled overnight bag and motioning imperiously for two bellhop robots to bring the rest of the luggage. Silent and smiling, they leaped to obey. The desk clerk was a human and greeted Walter with an efficient
when teller.
He offered Walter a pen and a registration card on which appeared some undecipherable combination of letters. Walter began to have a sense of unreality about the whole thing, as if he were still daydreaming in the Venus warp.
Really?
He said.
I seem to be quite confused.
With a smile of sudden comprehension, the clerk produced a manual and thumbed rapidly through its pages. He pointed to a phrase with the tip of his pen, and Walter read, "What price room do you desire?" Opposite these words was the phonetic jumble. WH room Uira. Walter shrugged to indicate that price was not important, but his thoughts were spinning. And they were still spinning when the robot bellhop left him alone in his suite. The possibility of a language barrier on Earth was something he had never considered. With only 6 months planned for his visit, it would be impossible to learn a new language and still do all he had dreamed of doing. But the von Königsbergs were noted for their stubbornness. Walter's chin set, and he opened the manual to learn what this was all about. He promptly realized that this was a manual only for the most elementary needs of conversation, and that a great amount of study would be necessary for normal discourse. The first section of the manual devoted a short chapter to each of the basic languages of Earth. Turning from one to another, Walter discovered that an extreme degree of condensation had taken place in all languages. It was as though a form of speedwriting and shorthand had been vocalized. But why? What did it mean? Walter found a partial explanation in the orientation section, which began,
Be brief. Soyez bref. Mark is curs. Sea breeze.
In a score of languages, first-time visitors were admonished that an understanding of these 2 words was essential to getting maximum enjoyment out of their stay on Earth.
Even in an elitary age.
The introduction pointed out.
The words be brief expressed the essence of a new way of life, a life in which pace and tempo were all important. Later, as technology and automation relieved man of the burden of labor, he realized that tempo was equally important to fullest enjoyment of his happy time hours. You will understand this better after a few pleasant days on Earth.
There was a false ring to the words that heightened Walter's sense of foreboding. Under the glass top of his dressing table, he saw several brightly coloured, attractively illustrated notices. One in particular caught his attention. It showed a young woman with lovely and poignantly expressive features. Her hands were outstretched as though she were singing or engaged in a dramatic scene. With the help of his manual, Walter ascertained that the young woman was named Maria Piovidi and that she was an Italian operatic soprano appearing currently in Uniport with the New York company. Walter's buoyancy began to return. What better way to become acquainted with Earth's culture than to spend his first evening at the opera? He removed the announcement with Maria Piovidi's picture from under the glass and stood it upright against the mirror. Dinner in the hotel's main dining room was a confusing interlude. The cuisine was superb, the robot waiter faultless, although Walter was beginning to weary of their fixed smiles. But more irritating was the flicker of huge tri-dimensional television screens on the walls of the dining room. When he deciphered his bills, he saw he had been taxed for the TV entertainment. After dinner, he showed the opera announcement to the hotel clerk and asked how to get there. The clerk wrote down the number of the monorail car he was to take, but when Walter learned the opera house was only 6 blocks away, he decided to walk. The clerk was aghast at this and followed him all the way to the sidewalk, waving his arms and protesting in an hysterical jumble of consonants. The opera house itself was a revelation. All he had dreamed of and more. The frescoed facade, the dazzling marquee, the crowd of elegantly dressed men and women animatedly speaking their strange syllables as they watched a floor show in the lobby. When the floor show ended and the crowd shifted to the far end where a pantomimist was beginning his act, Walter had a dear view of the life-size cutout of Maria Piovidi in the center of the lobby. He stood in front of it staring with an ashamed admiration. There was an earthiness and warmth about her that reminded him of the young women of his own planet. Paradoxically, there was also an air of remoteness and rigid self-discipline, the sense of emotion eternally controlled. He wondered which was the real Maria. Beside her picture was the photograph of a peppery old man whom Walter was able to identify as Willy Fritsch. The consonants under his name said he was now a producer and had formerly directed for many years. Walter purchased his ticket without too much difficulty. The lights blinked and he followed the crowd into the orchestra section. As he sank into the luxury of upholstered seats, Walter opened his senses to the sounds and sights about him, the tingling scent of the lovely women, the ebb and flow of indistinguishable conversation, the strange short bursts of music which he found to be emanating from a tiny dual radio in the purse of the woman who sat next to him. His excitement and anticipation grew still greater when he carefully deciphered the program and discovered that Maria Piovidi was to sing Gilda in Rigoletto this very evening. What unbelievable good luck! Rigoletto to commemorate his first evening on Earth. Walter vaguely knew the story of the opera, but from earliest childhood he could remember his mother singing snatches of Caro Nome and La Donna e Mobile. Now he would hear the entire arias, the full score of this masterpiece. Suddenly all was quiet. The orchestra rose swiftly into view in front of the stage. The white-haired leader bowed. There was an eruption of applause as brief as the crack of a rocket breaking the sound barrier. The golden baton rose, a glorious burst of music filled the opera house, and the velvet curtain zipped upward so rapidly that the blinking of an eye would have missed it. The opening scene of festal entertainment in the hall of the ducal palace was a masterpiece in conception, but the gay cavaliers and ladies, the duke's 20-second condensation of the
Presto quella.
Olata, the plotting with Rigoletto and the mocking of Monterone were all accomplished and done with before Walter knew what was happening. Then he realized that he was looking upon a tremendous revolving stage divided into many exquisite sets. Each set appeared majestically, established itself often with an almost indiscernible pause, and then moved out of view to be replaced by the next. The second scene was the deserted street outside Rigoletto's cottage. Rigoletto appeared and disappeared. Gilda and the disguised Duke flashed through their duets. The orchestra set up the briefest of fanfares, and the lovely Maria Piovidi moved to the center of the stage to sing Gilda's immortal aria.
Caro non ci il mi cor.
The words electrified Walter to the edge of his seat. Here were the first naturally spoken words of the opera, the words of Gilda as she expressed joy at learning the name of her lover. Walter's mother had sung the haunting words on many an evening as he drifted off to sleep in his nursery, but he had never heard them phrased so beautifully as they came now from the lips of Maria Piovidi. After the numbing shock of the first scene, they started the blood throbbing in his temples again, but they were the last words he understood of the aria. Using the archaic phrase with superb showmanship to startle her audience, Maria swung with flawless technique into a contraction of verse and music that somehow managed to convey the beauty of both in the few seconds that she held the center of the stage. It was like passing a star just before you entered hyperspace. You saw it for an instant, it awed and choked you with its wonder, and then it vanished into a nothingness that was deeper than night. There was so much beauty in the fragment that Walder ached to hear the rest of the aria. But Gilda had been abducted to the Duke's palace, and the stage had revolved far into Act 2 before Walder could assimilate the realization that no more of
Paranome
would be heard this evening or any evening. Nothing mattered after this, not even the Duke's half-minute condensation of
La Donna Immobile.
The stage picked up momentum, thunder and lightning flashed. The murdered Gilda's body was discovered by her father in the sack beside the river. The final curtain swooped down over the grisly horror. The orchestra disappeared, lights flashed on, and Waller found himself being hurried along with the pleased audience toward the exit, where server robots were passing out handbills and pointing to a theatre across the street. The entire opera had lasted 11 minutes. Stunned, his dream crumbling, Walder stood outside the opera house and watched the crowd disappear into the theatre across the street or plunge into passing monorail cars. The wind of the late afternoon was gone. A light snow was falling that melted on his cheeks and powdered the fur collar of his grey coat. Some of the younger couples didn't immediately board the monorail. They walked around to the stage exit and waited, laughing and chattering. Walder joined them. In a few moments, members of the cast began to appear. They waved gaily at friends in the crowd. Maria came out in the company of two young men, followed closely by the peppery, bright-eyed little man whom Walder recognized from the lobby poster as being Willie Fritsch, the producer. The young couples closed around them, applauding. Walder shouldered his way toward the center of the group. Maria was laughing with excitement. This was the warm, earthy Maria, not the exquisite, almost aloof artist Walder had seen on the stage. She was a full-lipped, gay Italian girl who was enjoying the plaudits of her friends. She was bundled in a white fur and her teeth flashed as she tossed back a rippling comment to one of the young men standing near Walder. As they started to move away, Walder stepped forward in sudden desperation.
"I beg pardon,"
he said.
"Can you wait while I try to ask one question?"
Maria looked startled, and one of her escorts stepped quickly between her and Walder.
"The royalty state?"
The young man snapped. Walder flushed at the tone. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way, certainly not by anyone his own age. His jaw set as he held on to his self-control and continued thumbing through the manual. Then he noticed that Maria was being hurried along by her other escort. He tried to step around the young man blocking his path. The young man put out his arm and pushed against Walder's shoulder as if to shove him back into the crowd. Out of the corner of his eye, Walder saw Willie Fritsch hurrying forward to intervene. But his own reflexes were already in motion. His left hand flashed up, the back of it struck the young man in the chest. Walder didn't intend it to be the blow, merely the warning. He even managed to check it before it landed. But to his bewilderment, the young man staggered back, slumped to his knees, gasping for breath. The other escort, though white-faced with fear, hurled himself at Walder. Still trying to maintain a measure of control, Walder merely blocked the second escort by thrusting out the palm of his hand. The young man toppled backward, and the whole scene began to take on a Never Never Land quality. Girls screamed in terror. The crowd around Walder scrambled out of his reach. Maria stared at him wide-eyed but didn't move.
"I'm terribly sorry,"
Walder blurted. There was a shrill whistle to drumbeat of running feet on the cold sidewalk. Walder moved forward to help the young men to their feet. They shrank away from him, and then he was surrounded by 3 armed police officers shouting a gibberish of commands. Finally, Willie Fritsch made himself heard. He pointed to Walder's manual and spoke a few patient words of explanation. When one of the officers still seemed unsatisfied, Willie turned to Walder with a twinkle in his eyes.
"They want to know if you're a professional pugilist."
Walder felt immeasurably relieved at hearing these naturally spoken words.
"Good Lord, no,"
he gasped. He took out his entry permits, his identification certificate, and his letters of credit impressively drawn up on the stationery of the Intergalactic Exchange Union on Deneb Roman II. When the doubting officer saw the amount of the credits, his hand shook and he handed the papers back to Walther as if they were state documents. The officers helped the two young men to their feet, admonished them sharply, tipped their hats to Walther, and hurried back to their posts. Willie regarded Walther quizzically.
Well, young man, you seem to have very persuasive ways.
At home it had been easy for Walther to slip from English to German. He did it now in the stress of the moment.
Ich kann einen nicht sagen, weil es mir tut.
He was in the middle of his apology before he realized he was talking German. He broke off in confusion. Willie's pink cheeks crinkled with amusement.
Ist gone gut. Ich spreche das Altdeutsch.
Willie went on to explain.
As a young man I translated many of the German masters into our modern happy time presentations.
Now, what is it you wanted to ask Miss Maria?
Walther addressed his question to Willie, but he looked at Maria as he spoke.
I wanted to ask if she would ever consider singing Rigoletto in its original form. I'd be happy to pay all expenses. I'm sure you would.
Willie said dryly.
But Miss Maria sings only the pure happy time essence of Rigoletto. Not for more than a century has Verdi's original version been sung on earth.
Maria looked puzzled during the interchange. Willie translated for her and she nodded in vigorous endorsement of his words. There was a titter of laughter from the young couples who had crowded around them again. Walther drew himself very erect.
Thank you,
he said. He turned on his heel and walked into the darkness beyond the stage exit. He walked blindly into the snow flurries, not caring where his steps were taking him. But he had not gone 200 yards before he realized he was being followed. Walther stopped and waited. The footsteps behind him drew closer. A slight shadow bulked out of the darkness and Walther heard Willie Fritsch say in German,
Don't be alarmed, young man.
Willie came up and linked his arm through Walther's.
Keep on walking, it's a cold night.
The chill air rattled in Willie's throat as he panted from the pace of overtaking Walther. When he caught his breath, he asked,
What sort of world do you come from?
It's quite amazing that someone from their Andromeda galaxy should ask for the original Rigoletto.
Walther told the old producer something of his home and family. Willie questioned him closely on several points and finally seemed satisfied.
When they come from the stars,
he murmured.
I beg your pardon? It is nothing, just the title of an old classic.
At the next corner Willie stopped.
I leave you here.
He stepped closer to Walther and lowered his voice even though there was nothing around them but darkness and drifting snow.
Would you care to sample a bit of Bohemia, my boy?
Well, I guess so.
Walther answered doubtfully.
Tomorrow evening then at 8. 1400 Avenue B, apartment 21. Can you remember that? 1400 Avenue B, apartment 21. I must emphasize the need for discretion on your part. There will be important people present. Why do you trust me?
Walther challenged.
Because I am an old fool,
chuckled Willie Fritsch. The chuckle emboldened Walther to ask one more question.
Will Marita be there?
Now you are a fool. Willie took a step away, then returned, flicked on his cigarette lighter, and studied Walther thoughtfully.
Or maybe not.
He murmured.
Maybe not.
Perhaps Maria could be there this once.
He snapped out the lighter. With another chuckle, Willie disappeared into the darkness. 1400 Avenue B, apartment 21. 8 o'clock tomorrow evening. The directions whirled all night through Walther's fitful sleep. They intermingled with the strange company of server robots' unintelligible phrases, the dry chuckle of Willie Fritsch and the haunting voice of Maria Piavit beginning an area she would never finish. The next day Walther determined to find out how the cult of brevity had changed other fields of Earth's culture. He went first to the library, where foreboding hardened into bitter reality. Classic after classic was cut to its essence. Hamlet was reduced to a total reading time of 7 minutes. But the old librarian seemed embarrassed about this. By mutual reference to the manual, she managed to convey to him that a new edition would be out soon and that it would be edited down to 5 minutes reading time. Did he want to sign up for a copy? Walter gave her a stricken look and silently shook his head. Puzzled, she led him to the other classics on his list. Each was a new blow.
Great Expectations
Was cut to 20 pages, all of the row to one thin pamphlet. Henry James to a pocket-sized digest of less than 10 pages.
Leaves of Grass
To a few lines of verse. Walter's sense of loss became more than personal. He saw and counted generations of boys who would never know Whitman, who might never have time for the open road in the spring, the sweet springtime of life. The road and the poem, they were part of each other. Without one the other could not live. The fire of Walter's dream flamed up fiercely within him. There was yet time for beauty in Andromeda. Time for quiet and thinking and true leisure. Somehow he must rescue the treasures of the ages from the tomb of earth and let them live again 750,000 light years away. He beckoned to the old librarian and laboriously communicated his question.
The originals of these classics, where are they?
She frowned in bewilderment. He pointed to the proper words again and gestured with his hands to indicate a large book. A smile of understanding replaced her frown. She consulted a larger edition of his own manuals and wrote, "Digesters faults lower 6 levels." He wrote back, "Can I go down there?" After some delay she encoded the answer. "Only authorized happy time digesters are permitted in the vaults." Walter thanked her glumly. His spirits were so depressed that not even the digested version of the Bible shocked him too greatly. The Old Testament amounted to 11 pages in rather large type. The Gospel of St. Mark was 3 paragraphs. The Acts of the Apostles spanned less than half a page. Walter left the library and the icy wind roused him from depression. It lashed him to anger, to a desperate and reasoning anger that drove him to find somewhere on earth an ember of the old culture. Somewhere he had to find such an ember and bring it back to Neustadt where it would flame again. He managed to get directions to the Vienna Stratoregal. Surely in Vienna he would find some trace of the spirit left by Mozart and Haydn, Beethoven, Schubert and Strauss. 10 minutes later, when he left the Stratoway in the Platz terminal near the Vienna Ring, his heart beat a little faster. This was indeed the old Vienna as he had envisaged it from the few pictures he had seen and the many stories he had been told. The buildings on the ring were in good repair and not substantially altered. There was the Berg Theatre, the Art and History Museum, the buttressed facade of the ancient opera house, the soaring twin spires of the votive church. It was like seeing an old wood had come to life. But for Walter that was all that came to life in Vienna. The Berg Theatre was currently presenting Faust in what was billed as a brilliant new production scaled down to 17 minutes. Walter sadly recalled Goethe's prophetic line to Mein Leid und der unbekannten Mensch. My song sounds to the unknown multitude. Wandering outside the city itself into the footpath of the Wienerwald, Walter tried to lose himself among the gentle slopes and the old trees that cut latticework into the sky. He came suddenly upon the village of Tullnesing, where from a tiny sidewalk cafe music of a stringed ensemble came in short, quick bursts. It was Scherzo speeded up 100-fold with not 3 but an infinite number of quarter notes blurred into what sounded like a single beat. These were the Vienna woods. How could he ever tell his mother and father? Heartsick he returned to the Platz and found the Berlin Stratoway. In Berlin his bitterness grew. He had known it and her Den Linden must have changed through the centuries, but he was not prepared for such a pace of life, such a frenzy of leisure. Better not to have left Andromeda. Better always to have lived with a dream. The sight of 2 elderly burghers drinking beer reminded him of his own great-grandfather and gave him a heartening twinge of nostalgia. But as he stepped close to their table he saw that, as they sipped from their miniature steins, the fingers of their free hands beat out a rhythmic accompaniment to the convolutions of an adagio theme imaged on the tabletop television screen. The final irony came to him when he read the lines of Schiller carved over the entrance to a museum near the Brandenburg Gate. Because they were cut deep into the old stone they could not be erased or condensed. They were there to give their ironic message to a world that could no longer read them. Only through the morning gateway of the beautiful did you enter the land of knowledge. And beneath them was Schiller's immortal warning to the artist. Der Menschheit Word ist in ihrer Hand gegeben. Bewahrt sei. Walder copied the entire passage on the back of his manual. This at least he could take back with him. These words he could preserve for the artists who would someday create their works of beauty on the frontier of Andromeda. As he copied them, Walder felt that the words were also a personal message from Schiller to himself. The dignity of mankind is placed in your hands. Preserve it. Whether it sinks or rises depends on you. The holy spell of poetry serves a wise world ordered. May it guide man to that great sea, where harmony prevails. The words sustained Walder's spirits until he left the Strataway in Paris and went to the Louvre. He had told himself that by this time nothing could shock him, that he could take any blow. But the Louvre was a new shock all over again. Translating a title with the help of his manual and the server robot guide, Walder found that the thin wavering line about 2 inches long against a background of misty blue was the Mona Lisa. The server robot explained after much searching among its tapes for words.
This is the spirit of the famous Mona Lisa smile. The Happy Time artist has cleverly removed all non-essential details so that you can get the meaning of the picture in the minimum amount of time.
Walder studied the thin, wavering line. This, then, was Da Vinci's eternal enigma of womanhood. Perhaps it explained why he felt there were 2 Marias. Could there be one whole woman in a culture of fragmented lives? The portraits of Holbein were reduced to a few sprinkles of geometric design shot through with a single brilliant colour. The nudes of Watteau, Rubens and Velázquez were little more than shadow curves. In the east wing of the Louvre, the server robot pointed to a series of larger paintings. Each of these, Walder learned, summarized the entire life work of a single artist. Here it was possible to see all of Titian or Michelangelo or Van Gogh on one simplified canvas. Where were the originals of these classics? In the cultural vaults at Uniport, the server robot explained. Only authorized Happy Time artists could work with them. Afterwards, Walder was never quite certain what happened to the rest of his day. Distraught, he wandered around the earth, changing from Strataway to Strataway, scarcely paying any heed to his next destination. Rome, Athens, Moscow, Jerusalem. Everywhere the pace of leisure was the same. Cape Town, New Delhi, Tibet, Tokyo, San Francisco. Everywhere he saw something that crumbled his dream a little more. The Buddhist monk pausing for 10 seconds of meditation while he counted his beads, not one by one but in groups of 20. The World Government Chamber, where the senator from the United States filibustered a proposal to death by speaking for the unprecedented period of 4 minutes. The cafe near the school, where teenage boys and girls, immense numbers of them, danced, snapped their fingers and shrieked ecstatically as the latest popular record exploded in a wild 3-note burst of sound. It was 7 o'clock in the evening before Walder became aware of the time. He was half the earth and just 1 hour away from his meeting with Willy Fritsch. 1400 Avenue B, Apartment 21. A bit of Bohemia Willy had promised him. The words disturbed Walder. He had been disappointed so often in his 24 hours on earth that he didn't feel like bracing himself for another letdown. Nor did he feel in the mood for a gay evening, if that was what Willy had meant. Would Maria be there? Walder shook his head angrily. He was indeed a fool if he expected anything after this day. 1400 Avenue B was only a few moments by monorail from the Hotel Altair. A gentle-faced woman who reminded Walder of his own mother answered his knock on the door of apartment 21. KDFEC. She inquired politely. Walder stared at her. Was this all a cruel joke played by Willy Fritsch? Certainly this elderly woman, this quiet building, contained no Bohemia to be spoken of with discretion.
Excuse me,
He muttered, not even bothering to consult his manual. He bowed and backed away.
I'm afraid I've made a mistake.
She stayed him with a small gesture of her delicate fingers. Glancing swiftly up and down the hall, she beckoned him inside. When the door was closed, she smiled a bright welcome and spoke in the old tongue. "You're the young man from Andromeda." Walder felt the tension inside him beginning to relax. He nodded and she took his arm.
Willy told us we've been expecting you.
She led him from the small foyer into a large, tastefully furnished living room. Walter glanced around uncertainly, but his first impression proved correct. There was no one else here. The woman urged him forward with a light touch of her fingertips.
We must be so careful,
she murmured. She guided him through the living room past the kitchen and one bedroom, and then opened the door of what appeared to be the entrance to a second bedroom. This room was unexpectedly large and contained many people. They were talking with great animation, but hushed abruptly as he entered.
The young man from Andromeda,
his hostess announced. The dry voice of Willie Fritsch came through the haze of cigarette smoke.
Over here, boy. Come and sit down.
He saw Willie and Maria sitting on a long cushion against the far wall. They moved over to make room for him. Maria smiled rather hesitantly. He sensed she was very ill at ease.
I'll introduce you around later,
said Willie.
Everybody's too keyed up right now. We've just had an unexpected surprise, really quite startling.
The conversation had bubbled up again, and there was an electric feeling of excitement in the air. Everyone was trying to talk at the same time. Cheeks were flushed, eyes sparkled. While everyone was talking to those nearest, the most constantly recurring focal point of attention was a thin, balding man seated just across the room from Walter on the arm of the sofa. He was riffling the pages of a pocket-sized notebook and smiling with self-conscious pride. Willie nodded toward the man.
There's the gentleman who furnished our surprise, who brought shorthand notes on an entire chapter from Don Quixote.
After the day he had just been through, Walter could appreciate this. He asked wonderingly,
Where did he get them?
He's a happy-timed jester.
Walter studied the little man. So this was one of the comparative few on Earth who could get into the deep vaults of a Uniport library. What wonders he must have explored. What beauty and adventure, what mind-stretching thoughts he must encounter in those underground catacombs. How deep into the past he could explore, how far into the future. Wide he could range the universe faster than the warp drive out even beyond the Andromeda galaxy. Willie cut into his thoughts. He's going to read the entire chapter. Walter turned to Maria to see if she shared his excitement. It was the aloof, controlled Maria who smiled faintly at him. It was obvious she had come against her will and was trying to be gracious about it. A middle-aged couple arrived.
Dr. and Mrs. Althus,
Willie whispered.
He's the famous heart surgeon.
The next arrival was a distinguished-looking man whose finger shook with nervousness.
That's the World Government alternate delegate from England.
Willie whispered again.
It wouldn't do his reputation any good for word to get out that he spent an evening in this bohemian crowd.
Their hostess moved to the center of the room, raised her hand and announced,
We're all here now. Please go ahead, Lon.
The room quieted instantly. The thin little man proudly began in Old English.
Don Cervante at the castle.
His reading was painfully slow, and he stumbled over the pronunciation of many words. The people in the room watched him so intensely with such absolute concentration that they gave the impression of reading his lips rather than listening to his words. Frequently he would have to translate a word or phrase into the new language, and there would be nods of understanding and relief. Willie's bright blue eyes sparkled more brightly than ever. He ran his fingers constantly through his thin bristle of white hair. The elderly woman on the sofa beside the digester was so flushed and breathing so rapidly that Walter feared she was on the verge of a stroke. Even the urbane heart surgeon showed the emotional impact of this experience. His long tapered fingers were clenched together, and he ran his underlip constantly over the edge of his greying moustache. Maria seemed the only one in the room who was not affected by the reading. Only a slight tightening of her lips marred her careful composure. Soon Walter lost himself in the tingling excitement of the room, and he forgot about watching the others. Word by word, sentence by sentence, the digester led them along with Don Cervante. The reading, with its many pauses for translation, took almost 2 hours. When it was over, everyone was emotionally and physically exhausted. The little digester was so pale he looked ill, his high forehead dripped with perspiration. Walter drew a long breath and brought himself reluctantly back to reality. Willie asked quietly,
"What do you think of our intellectual underworld?"
An outbreak of almost hysterical conversation made it useless for Walter to answer. Maria, with a look of reproach at Willie, moved across the room to speak to their hostess. Willie lit one of his cigars and leaned closer to Walter. There was a gleam of amusement in his twinkling blue eyes.
"You look more worn out than Don Cervantes."
He chuckled. The contrast between this evening and the disillusionment of the day made it hard for Walter to put his gratitude into words.
"I can't thank you enough."
He began.
Don't try.
Said Willie.
I may have had my own devious reasons for inviting you.
He glanced toward Maria, who was making an effort at polite conversation with the hostess.
"I'm afraid our young diva isn't an ardent admirer of the unexpurgated Don Quixote."
There were many questions Walter wanted to ask about Maria, but he tactfully inquired instead.
"How often does this group meet?" "Whenever there is something to share, a chapter of literature, a copy of an old painting, a recording. It all depends on what our few digester friends can manage. They don't have an easy time of it, you know." "Is it difficult for them to take things out of the vaults?" "Difficult. And dangerous."
Willie answered grimly.
But why?
"For reasons that make good sense, officially at least. A culture founded on brevity cannot be expected to encourage its own demise through the acts of its civil servants. Think what could happen. A total work of art, whatever its form, takes time to appreciate. But if people spend too long at an opera, the legitimate theatre or the television industry would be slighted. If they paused too long in contemplation of a painting, newspapers might not be purchased. If they dawdled over the old-style newspaper, the digest magazines, the popular recordings, the minute movies, the spectator sports, the 1,001 forms of mass recreation offered the public, each in turn would suffer from unrestrained competition. It's inconceivable,"
Walter protested.
"that entertainment interests could be strong enough to shape a culture. Surely the productive basis of Earth's economy."
Willie snorted.
"My boy, work as such may still be important in Andromeda, but how could it possibly be so here on Earth? Generations ago, automation, the control of the atom, the harnessing of the sun's energy all combined with many other factors to make work a negligible part of man's existence. Thus, with 4/5 of his waking hours devoted to leisure time pursuits, the balance of power shifted inevitably to the purveyors of mass entertainment. Great monopolies operating under the Happy Time Limited cartel seized upon the digest trend in the old culture and made brevity the basis of the new order. The briefer you make a piece of entertainment, the more pieces you can sell the public in a given number of leisure hours. It's just good business,"
Willie concluded dryly. Walter was silent a moment, trying to frame this picture in his thoughts. But there were so many missing elements.
"You're artists and writers."
He demanded.
All your creative people, don't they have anything to say about it?
"Damn little. You see, the successful artist, whatever his field, is well paid by his particular monopoly. Besides, he's been trained in the new form. I doubt if Marifa has ever seen the original score of an opera, let alone tried to sing an entire aria."
Willie took a glass of wine from a tray offered by the host to his server robot. He motioned to Walter to help himself, but Walter shook his head. Another question was troubling him.
Why do the monopolies even bother with digesters and the classics? Why not let modern artists create in the new form?
Willie's voice grew hard.
Because
He snapped.
There have been no creative artists on Earth for over a century.
Why create when your creation is only fed into the maw of the digesters? That which is not wanted dies in a culture as well as in the human body.
That, my young friend from Andromeda, is the bitter tragedy of it all. Maria rejoined then and whispered something to Willie. The old producer sighed and turned to Walter.
Maria would like to leave now. Will you take her back to our hotel? There are some people here I must see. Of course.
Yet, in spite of his eagerness to get better acquainted with Maria, Walter was reluctant to leave. There was so much more he wanted to ask, to learn. And deep beneath the surface of his thoughts a bold idea was beginning to form. As if reading his mind, Willie said,
"We have no performance tomorrow afternoon. Come and see me at our hotel, we'll talk further. Meanwhile,"
Willie's blue eyes sparkled again.
"Meanwhile, for the young the evening is still young. It should be an interesting challenge."
Maria said nothing until they had left the apartment building and started across the street to the monorail station. Then she stopped, drew a long breath of the wintry air and shook her head. "WHD or BLVNG?" she exclaimed. She smiled at his puzzled expression and tucked her arm through his. When they were inside the station, he handed her his manual. She flipped through the pages but could not find the exact translation of her remark. Finally, she picked out parts of 3 phrases. Put together, they read,
"What a terrible evening."
After the first shock of her words, Walter realized he could expect her to feel no differently. She was a product of her culture, and evidently this had been her first visit to Willie's Bohemia. It was past midnight when they boarded the monorail and they were alone in the car. Fumbling in her purse for a coin, Maria pointed to the small screen on the back of the seat in front of them. Walter offered a handful of coins. She put one into the slot beside the screen. A comedy sequence appeared, lasting for approximately 30 seconds. Much of it was lost to Walter because he couldn't understand the dialogue. But Maria laughed gaily. The tension lines, the outward evidences of inner emotional control, began to smooth away. Her cheeks flushed, her dark eyes began to sparkle. This was a Maria Walter felt he could learn to know. When the television screen went dark, Maria promptly put another coin into a slot beside a small grid. A full-scale orchestra sounded what might have been the first chord of a symphony, but the piece was over before Walter could identify it. A third coin dropped into the arm of the seat, produced a small 2-page magazine which seemed to consist chiefly of pictures. One of the pictures showed Maria herself in operatic costume. She studied it critically, then tossed the magazine into a handy receptacle under the seat. A fourth coin brought out a game from the side of the monorail car. It vaguely resembled checkerboards, except that there were only 6 squares and 2 magnetized checkers. Maria guided his hand while he made 2 moves. As she completed her last move, the board automatically folded back into the side of the car. A 5th coin summoned a miniature keyboard from just beneath the television screen. Maria touched the keys, producing tinkling noises that sounded like a tiny celeste. Then the keyboard zipped back into its enclosure. Maria reached for a 6th coin. Walter closed his hand over hers and made a motion to indicate that his head was already in a whirl. She laughed but didn't try to remove her hand. A moment later, the monorail stopped in front of their hotel. As they crossed the lobby, Walter pointed inquiringly toward the cocktail lounge. Maria smiled and nodded gaily. A server robot waiter seated them at a small chrome table beside a tiny dance floor. Maria ordered their drinks and the waiter was back with them in a matter of seconds. The glasses seemed extremely small to Walter compared to the huge mugs and steins he was accustomed to on Newstead. The liquor tasted rather bland, more like a sweet wine than a whiskey. The server robot presented a bill with the drinks. Money had never meant anything to Walter, but he could scarcely repress a start when he deciphered the amount of the bill. By any standard of wealth or exchange, the drinks were fantastically expensive. A scattering of applause announced the return of the orchestra. Maria held out her hand in an invitation to Walter. With some misgivings, he led her out on the dance floor. She turned and came into his arms so naturally and suddenly that she almost took his breath away. She danced very close to him. Her cheek was warm, and the faint perfume from the tip of her ear was something he would have liked to explore more thoroughly. But the moment was over before it began. The music stopped, the orchestra leader bowed and led his men from the stage. Back at the table, Walter lifted his glass to suggest another drink. She shook her head, explaining,
"Ondokst."
Spelled out with his manual, her explanation was,
"Only one drink is permitted."
and after Willie's brief orientation this was understandable. Nothing could disrupt the perpetual entertainment cycles more easily than excessive drinking. A tipsy person was not a good customer for other leisure time activities. Therefore permit only one drink to a person and charge enough for it so that the liquor monopoly would get its fair share of the entertainment expenditure. As Willie would say, it was just good business. Maria touched his hand to signify it was time to leave. Walter took her up to her room on the 32nd floor and they watched two musical comedies en route on the elevator pay-as-you-see television screen. In front of her door, Maria lightly touched the back of his hand with her fingertips. She said,
"Life ready, son."
Walter knew she was thanking him, but from force of newly acquired habit he reached for his manual. She laughed, shook her head, and translated her own words by raising up on tiptoe and brushing his lips with her own. Their lips were together so briefly that Walter wasn't sure whether he had really kissed her. He reached out to take her in his arms and make sure of it. Deftly she turned away and closed her door behind her. Many thoughts interfered with Walter's second night of sleep on Earth, and they weren't only of Maria. In fact, as his idea took form, even the scent of her perfume and the moth-like touch of her lips were forced temporarily into the background of his consciousness. The next morning he waited impatiently for an hour after breakfast, then went up to Willie's room. Willie came to the door in his dressing robe, holding his glasses in one hand and a sheet of music in the other. He waved aside Walter's apology for not waiting until afternoon.
Nee.
Neen.
He said,
I ordered an extra pot of coffee because I didn't think you could wait.
Willie led Walter into his sitting room and poured him some coffee.
Maria was already here.
He chuckled.
She came too.
Ah.
Hiccup music. And to ask what I know about you. I told her nothing good and nothing bad.
He settled himself in his easy chair with a luxurious sigh. His bristling white hair and cherubic cheeks gave him the appearance of a benign old innkeeper brought to life from a canvas by Holbein.
All right, tell me what you've been thinking about all night.
Walter shifted tensely to the edge of his chair. He spilled a little coffee in setting his cup down.
I would like to buy copies.
He said,
Of everything your digester friends have ever smuggled out of the vaults.
That's a large order, my young friend. I'll pay. Whatever it costs. So would I if I could afford it. But I fear it's not that simple. Take, for example, the chapter of Don Quixote you heard last evening. The World Government representative from England sent the digester's notes to an aunt in Liverpool. She'll read them to her Bohemian friends tonight, and tomorrow they may be in Buenos Aires or Istanbul, who knows. But what happens to them eventually? Aren't they kept in some central place?
Willie spread his short pudgy fingers in a gesture of hopelessness.
That would mean organization, and we're not organized. We wouldn't dare to be. I've never stopped to think what finally happens to these things. Perhaps they end up among the papers of some old dreamer like myself. It's enough that they have brought their mellow moments of happiness. It's not enough.
Walter protested fiercely.
It's a great waste. How will you ever improve things that way? Who's trying to improve anything? The people of Earth are content, and those of us who are not entirely so, well, we have our little underworlds of pleasure. Is that all you want? Is there more?
Walter jumped up angrily.
I believe there is, and I think you do too.
He said harshly.
If you don't, why did you take me to that meeting last night and invite me here today?
Why did you send me off alone with Maria?
Willie only smiled, but under his silk robe his round belly shook with silent laughter.
You are a foolish young man.
And sometimes not so foolish.
Sit down. Sit down.
He leaned forward in his easy chair and his manner became grave.
Perhaps it's difficult for an old man to come near the end of life fearing that the beauty he loves will never escape from its tomb. Perhaps it's also difficult for an old maestro who cherishes the talent and loveliness of a young woman to know that she may never understand what her gift really means. Perhaps an old man can still dream some dreams that a young man could not comprehend.
The tight knot in Walter's stomach slowly unwound itself.
Then you will help me.
he said quietly.
Yes, I will help you.
If I can. And you will help me.
After Willie's suggestion, they decided to talk first to the digester who had smuggled out the Don Quixote chapter.
He's been most successful of all of our friends.
Said Willie.
He might be willing to organize a group of digesters who could bring out things to be duplicated and return them. I question, though, that you could duplicate many things here on Earth. Then we'll ship them away from Earth. The outermost world of this galaxy, at least to my knowledge, is old and Roman, for it's technically well developed and is a contact with our own galaxy.
Willie called the bald little digester and he came over right after lunch. But his reaction to Walter's proposal was not what they had expected.
This is a terrible mistake.
He stammered.
It's too big, much too big. Now by being cautious we can enjoy our little evenings together. But if we anger the happy time limited, people will lose everything.
Willie snapped his fingers impatiently.
What have we to lose? A chance to be teacup rebels. This young man is giving us an opportunity to do something about what we profess to believe.
The digester looked pained.
We are already doing something.
He protested. Did I not bring Chapter 9 of Don Quixote?
You did, and we enjoyed it. But what if we could inspire a rebirth of art as big as a whole galaxy instead of entertaining each other with our little flings at Bohemia?
The little digester struggled with the thought for a moment, then dismissed it with a shudder.
It's too big,
he repeated miserably.
Please forget about it. We'll our own ways best.
He glared at Walter and his distrust turned to rage.
I warn you, young man. Don't start trouble for us. If you can't accept the ways of Earth, go back where you belong.
He held out a trembling hand to Willie.
Good be Willie.
I go now.
He hesitated, then added with the wistful air of a small boy waiting to be praised.
In 2 weeks I will bring another whole chapter to read.
When Willie only shrugged, the little digester turned away and sadly left the room. During the next 2 days, Willie contacted several of the digester friends. In varying degrees, he met with refusals from each. By the end of the week, only 2 of the younger digesters in the Bohemian set had agreed to cooperate, and even they were careful not to promise too much.
At this rate,
Walter pointed out glumly,
it will take years to collect any real quantity of material, and I have only 6 months. Is there no other source?
Willie shook his head.
None that I know of. There must be.
Walter insisted.
Do you mean to tell me that in all the homes of Earth there are no treasured heirlooms of the past? No books? No paintings?
No recordings.
Oh, I'm sure they are.
Willie agreed.
But how to reach them?
We can hardly advertise.
He paused, hesitated, then snapped his fingers.
Wait, there may be a way even more illegal than your first suggestion, but still a way.
What is it? I used the word underworld in speaking of our Bohemian group last night, but actually there's an underworld, of a sort. Trafficking mostly in liquor. The cartel's one-drink restriction has never been too enforceable.
Willie lifted the seat of his piano bench and took out a bottle.
If you can afford it, you can always buy a bootleg supply. What's liquor got to do with art? For a price, the underworld may be willing to traffic in art, literature and music, in addition to alcohol.
Willie sent out word through a bootlegger who supplied some of the opera singers with their favourite beverages. The next night, after final curtain, a greying, bespectacled and very distinguished-looking gentleman in formal dress met Willie and Walter in a vacant dressing room backstage. He spoke tersely and Willie translated.
He says he has friends who could be interested in your proposition if there's money enough in it. Tell him there's money enough.
Walter replied grimly. Willie digested this and their visitor smiled his skepticism. Not accustomed to having his financial standing questioned, Walter faced the man himself and demanded,
How much money do you want?
The man understood Walter's tone, if not his words. After a brief calculation, he named a price that shocked Willie, who turned to Walter with dismay.
10,000 credits for every usable piece of art that can be bought outright. An additional deposit of 10,000 if it has to be sent away from Earth to be duplicated. You are to pay all shipping costs, as well as legal expenses if any of their men are arrested.
Walther accepted the terms with a nod. Their underworld contact stared respectfully at Walther, took off his suede gloves and proceeded to get down to business. It was soon arranged for Walther to set up letters of credit in banks of all major cities. Shipments of
tools and machinery
would be billed against these credits after bills of lading had been inspected by Walther or a designated representative. From the level of the discussions, they might have been transacting legal business on a corporation scale. Their visitors shook hands with each of them, doffed his top hat and left with a courteous bow. Willie wiped shining beads of sweat from his forehead.
High finance
He gasped.
Is not a part of my daily routine.
He dug into a wardrobe trunk, brought out a bottle and poured 2 drinks. Raising his glass high in the air, he toasted
to art and crime. I hope we don't have to pay too much for either. How are you getting along with Maria?
Willie asked a few days later.
Just what do you expect to accomplish by throwing the two of us together so much?
Walther asked bluntly.
Oh, I enjoy it, mind you, but really, we're worlds apart. When I go back, with the young everything is possible, even the impossible.
Willie answered evasively. Well, tell me something more about her.
Where does she come from?
Has she ever been engaged?
Married?
Willie filtered a cloud of smoke through his nostrils.
Mariva's the only talented offspring ever produced by a rather poor family in Naples. She still supports them, or rather, makes it possible for them to be good happy time consumers. As for her talent, well, it was discovered by her first school teacher, and from then on her education was taken over by the opera monopoly. Engaged? Nothing serious that I know of. Married?
Willie frowned.
I shudder to think of her marriage to one of our mechanical young rabbits.
Walther blinked.
Do you mind explaining that one?
Willie grimaced.
I might as well. You see, sex per se is encouraged, with or without the formality of marriage. Large numbers of offspring are good for society. We have the technology to provide for them, and the more there are, the more potential happy time consumers. But the arts of sex, the refinements of love. Can't you imagine by this time what takes place in the boudoirs of Earth? Sex is something to be accommodated between pay-as-you-see television programs. Besides, you've encountered a couple of our young men. Do you consider them physically capable of prolonged amour?
Walther was finding it heavy going to picture some of the things Willie was describing for him. But the mention of the 2 young men he had met outside the opera that first night brought up a question he'd been waiting to ask.
What was wrong with them? I barely touched them. Participation sports, physical activity of any kind is discouraged as interfering with the mass entertainment media. The few gifted boys are trained to be professionals. The others scarcely develop enough muscle to walk against a strong wind. In fact, they don't walk any more than is necessary.
Willie paced agitatedly around his room and stopped in front of Walther's chair. He held out his hands pleadingly.
Be patient with Maria.
He begged.
You promised to help me too.
And this is all I ask of you.
Walther didn't find it unpleasant to comply with Willie's request. He had nothing to do while waiting for the first shipment to be assembled, and so was able to attend rehearsals as well as the performances of the operas. At rehearsals he saw a serious Maria, the perfectionist devoted to her art, a superb technician. After rehearsals and the opera itself, he saw a Maria who was a product of the alien leisure time culture he had found on Earth, a Maria who flitted with tireless zest from one activity to another, who naturally and enthusiastically accepted the innumerable forms of entertainment offered by the happy time cartel. With growing despair, Walther tried to find some activity they could share. He had always enjoyed sports, so he took her to all the attractions at the Uniport arenas. Each was a new disappointment. What was billed as a fight for the world's heavyweight title ended with a 1-round decision. A basketball game was exciting for 3 furiously contested minutes. The professional tennis match consisted of each player serving 4 balls which the other attempted to return. While travelling to and from the various attractions, there were always the diversions offered on the monorail and strutaway cars. Private transportation, Walter learned after hopefully exploring this possibility, had been eliminated for the obvious reason that it was restricted in the number of recreational opportunities it permitted and might lead to overindulgence in sex from the point of view of the time involved rather than promiscuity. And while walking was not strictly illegal, those who tended to overindulge were advised to curtail their eccentricity. After much thought, Waller did hit upon a possibility that was prompted by his recollection that the natural beauty of such places as the Vienna woods had not been obscured. Since Maria was not required to be at rehearsals until 2 in the afternoon, they could spend the morning visiting some distant beauty spots he had read or heard about back on Neustadt. Perhaps in some of these places the pace of leisure would be slowed. Maria happily accepted his initial invitation to spend a morning in the South Sea Islands. They boarded a strutaway car immediately after breakfasting together at the hotel and soon had exchanged Chile Uniport for Languirus Tahiti. The island village, the natives and their costumes, the wet fragrance of the jungle and the soft rippling of the surf were all as Walter had pictured them since his first reading of Stevenson's Voyages to the South Seas. However, suspecting that a happy time cartel had probably made its presence felt in the village itself, Walter steered Maria around it toward a path that wound invitingly between the tall palms and growths of breadfruit trees. Maria's hand fell easily, naturally, into his own, and she pressed a little closer to him as if awed by the unaccustomed stillness. She smiled up at him, started to say something, but Walter put his finger over her lips and shook his head. Maria looked puzzled, then took out of her handbag a miniaturized self-powered television set with its own tiny coin meter. She popped in a coin, flicked the dial, and the image of an actor appeared on the screen. Walter covered it with his hand. He took the set away from her and dropped it into the pocket of his coat. Then he pointed to her to the shadowed trees around them and spread his hands as if to ask what more anyone could possibly want. He wasn't sure she understood, but he put his arm around her waist and she rested her head against his shoulder. They continued a dozen steps down the path until it ended at a silvery lagoon. Here she touched the radio button of her wristwatch, rented on a weekly basis, and the rhythm of a jazz band filled the tropical air. Walter took her wrist, shut off the radio. He turned her toward him and held her face tightly between the palms of his hands.
No television,
He said firmly.
no radio, no nothing except this.
She yielded with a faint smile. Her eyes closed, but their lips had scarcely touched when she tried to draw back.
Not that way.
Walter told her.
This way.
He held her face firmly, teaching her the kind of kisses that were used in a frontier world where people had time to make love. She struggled away from the unnaturalness of his kissing, then slowly she ceased to struggle. Suddenly the lagoon was lighted by a brilliant spotlight and a server robot stepped out of the shadows. It said pleasantly,
Since only tourists come to this spot, it is presumed that you come from some distant planet. Therefore, let me point out that all couples are limited to 2 minutes by the lagoon. If you hurry, you can catch a native dance number before the next strataway leaves.
In the same pleasant tone, the server robot began to repeat these words in the other ancient languages of Earth. Maria's breath came in short, trembling gasps. Her lips were still apart, and she touched them with the tip of her tongue.
While när tusen nack diesem flexion erd common.
The server robot droned along in its pleasing voice.
Oh, shut up.
Walter growled. He took Maria by the arm and led her back up the path.
Somehow.
He promised her fervently.
Somewhere we're going to finish that.
DTHG end. She whispered in breathless wonder. The first shipment of
Tools and machinery
had been assembled at the Uniport landing. Walter received a formal notice to this effect from the local exchange bank. The same evening, in a backstage dressing room, he and Willy Fritsch received a rather more informative report from the gentleman who was their contact with the bootleg underworld. Every item in the shipment was listed and described with meticulous care. By reference to a leather-bound pocket notebook, the contact managed to furnish additional details. With Willie's help, Walter was able to judge the nature of the haul. He was both pleased and disappointed. Numerically, it had more items than he had expected. Qualitatively, it left much to be desired. There were no complete literary works, only fragments. The pictures were admittedly cheap copies, the recordings were only passages from major works. A total of 800 items had been purchased outright by underworld agents. 1,400 more had been borrowed on the security of the huge deposit. The latter would have to be duplicated on Olden Roman 4 and returned to their Earth owners as quickly as possible. Walter had expended a huge fortune for a dubious return. But through Willie he told the contact.
Heap it up. Get everything you can.
Several items did look promising from an elderly spinster in Durban, South Africa. The first 2 acts of
Othello
had been obtained by the bootlegger who delivered her dry sack sherry twice a month in New Orleans. An undertaker had parted with a nearly complete Louis Armstrong original. About an inch was broken off one edge of the record, but the bill of lading stated that the rest was quite audible. There was also what was reported to be the last third of
Crime and Punishment,
loaned by a lawyer in Prague. The second shipment was on a par with the first, with the hopeful indication that some of the new acquisitions would complement others in the first shipment. Walter stood beside Willie at the Uniport landing as the shuttle ship carrying their second shipment blasted off on the first leg of the long route to far-off Olden Roman 4. The third shipment was much smaller, only 300 outright purchases and 720 items obtained against deposit. With the bill of lading came a warning note. Walter translated it himself. It was from their contact, who wrote,
Don't try to get in touch with me until further notice. Send off the shipment as soon as possible. The Happy Time boys know something big is going on.
By paying a fabulous premium, Walter was able to get the third shipment off on the midnight shuttle. Afterwards he stood in the window of Willie's hotel room staring up at the star-filled sky.
Well, that may be the end of it,
he said.
You've done well,
said Willie, joining him.
I didn't think you'd get that much. I hope it'll do some good. Perhaps all this new material will at least form the basis of a good research library.
Willie glanced at him speculatively.
I was disappointed about the music,
he said.
Not one complete work.
By this time, Walter had learned to know when Willie was maneuvering toward an objective.
Just tell me what you've got in mind.
He grinned.
No preliminaries.
Willie chuckled his appreciation, then grew serious.
Our opera season ends this week. We're supposed to take a month off, then start rehearsals for the next tour. Perhaps during this month.
Walter sensed what was coming next, but he held his breath waiting for Willie to say it. Willie did.
Perhaps if you still want to spend more money to pay them, we could persuade some of our group to record a full-length opera.
Walter exclaimed.
Could they do it?
Willie pursed his lips thoughtfully.
As for willingness, you've observed that your wealth is rather persuasive enough.
Like most artists, our people spend more than they earn, and would probably try anything for what you could pay them. As for ability, we'd undoubtedly have to record in short sessions. We might even have to break up the areas into sections, because we're not conditioned for sustained effort. I'll pay them anything to try it.
Walter broke in enthusiastically.
Where would you try it here in Uniport? Hardly. But there's an old inn in North Wales where I once spent a vacation with some of our group. If the Happy Time agent should be watching us now, it would be quite natural to return to that inn. Maria.
Do you think she would? Willie sighed and shrugged. Not for the money alone.
She's quite a perfectionist about her art. But I'm hopeful that by this time.
His eyes twinkled. Walter laughed.
What a chess player you would make. I think you've been moving me around like a pawn ever since the first evening we met. Not a pawn.
Willie corrected him with a smile.
A knight.
However, they decided not to tell Maria the real purpose of the proposed vacation until they were all set up at the inn in North Wales. Walter thought the setting sounded perfect for some personal unfinished business.
Even I could sing an airy in such a place.
Willie enthused. Willie began quietly and individually contacting other members of his company. With the kind of payment Walter authorized him to offer, he had little difficulty getting performers for the venture. Most of them thought the project ridiculous, but the money was more than they would normally earn in an entire season. Willie swore each of them to silence. They were to treat the trip as nothing more than a vacation. He made arrangements for the various pieces of recording equipment to be shipped separately from London, Berlin, and New York. Willie's pink cheeks were perpetually flushed these days, and his bright eyes sparkled brighter than ever. When Walter brought up the question of which opera would be attempted, he discovered that the shrewd old maestro had long ago acquired Puccini's complete
Madame Butterfly,
and had already packed the music for shipment to North Wales. The night before they were to leave Uniports, a familiar, distinguished figure appeared backstage, threading his way between the huge crates being packed by the server robot stagehands. Willie led him immediately to one of the dressing rooms. With admirable simplicity, the underworld contact put a proposition before them. The first 3 shipments had pretty well exhausted the supply of readily obtainable material. With the Happy Time agents now alerted, the risk of trying to get more material wasn't justified by the probable results. But the underworld wasn't anxious to let go of a good revenue source without one big payoff. What did they propose to do? Willie's voice shook as he translated.
but for the right fee they are willing to break into the Uniport library vaults.
Walter was silent for a long moment. Instinctively he recoiled from such overt action. But reason asked, why should he draw back now? Everything taken from the vaults would be duplicated and returned in good condition. Was it right to let his own personal reaction stand in the way of something that might benefit whole ages of mankind? When he had firm control of his own voice, he nodded and asked,
How do they propose to do it?
The plan was a piece of professional craftsmanship. In the century of its existence, no one had ever attempted to enter the new library illegally. With the absence of any known motive for doing so, the need for guarding against it was routine. There were the usual doors and time locks, the alarm systems and server robot cards, but nothing that couldn't be handled. They would bring in technicians from Vigo VI to handle the time locks. Otherwise, barring some unsuspected move by the Happy Time security police, the job was within the bounds of their own abilities. Of course, there must be meticulous attention to detail and planning. The contact explained that, according to preliminary surveys, they could count on about 2 hours of work after gaining entrance to the vaults. By concentrating only on books for speed of handling and packing, the reasonable-sized crew should be able to get at least 20,000 volumes out of the vaults and into awaiting monorail transport, where the crates would already be assembled. Previous arrangements could be made for the midnight freight shuttle to take the crates from the Uniport landing to Singis Roman 3. From there, the crates could be dispersed throughout the immeasurable reaches of deep space.
But they must be returned.
Walter insisted.
I'll see to that.
Their visitor shrugged, indicating that this detail was of no interest to him. He named a price, and when Walter promptly agreed to it, Willie poured them all a drink.
When I was a small boy,
Willie said in a voice that still trembled.
I slid on the seat of my trousers down an icy slope in the Alps. It was good fun for the first 20 yards, and then I realized I had gone beyond my power to stop. That's the way I feel right now. Prosit.
As their caller started to leave, Walter stopped him by raising his hand. Throughout the discussion, an irresistible compulsion had been growing within him. Now he had to speak.
I've come a long ways.
He told Willie.
Granting that nothing goes wrong, and that I am able to leave, I know I'll never return to Earth again. But there's one selfish, personal thing I want to do before leaving. It isn't sensible, I know, but neither was my dream to begin with. I want to go with these men into the Uniport vaults just to see for now greater treasures than I could ever hope to see again.
From his room on the second floor of the Bridge End Inn, Walter could look down upon the River Dee tumbling along beside what was still called the Shropshire and Union Railroad Canal, although the tracks of that ancient railroad had been torn up centuries ago. Old ways and names had a way of persisting in North Wales despite the pace of modern leisure. Walter had noted with satisfaction that the double consonants of the old language with their strange throaty pronunciation had defied contraction. Angolan and Anticilio were two nearby cities whose names were still spelled out as they had been for 1,000 years. He glanced at his watch. Maria should be waking from her nap just about now. In a half-hour Willie wanted to meet with her and ask her cooperation in doing.
Madame Butterfly.
Walter had suggested waiting until the next day since Maria was tired from the closing night festivities in Uniport and from packing the rest of the night in time to catch the morning straight away. But Willie opposed delay. As he stood there by his window, Walter had a sense of peace for the first time since he'd been on Earth. The moment was all the more to be cherished since he knew it could not last. A light knock on his door jarred the view and the peace out of focus.
Come in.
He called and turned, expecting to see Willie. But it was Maria who entered, looking remarkably refreshed after her short nap. She wore a sweater, a very short skirt, and open-toed sandals. Her long dark hair was combed out loose. It was the first time he had seen her dressed so casually. She looked more like a Welsh mountain girl than the star of the Uniport opera.
Hi.
He said inadequately. She laughed at his surprise and put her arms around him. Hi. She'd answered. Maria had not forgotten her first lesson beside the Tahiti lagoon, and Walter was reviewing some subsequent lessons when both of them became aware of the unwelcome fact that they were not alone. Willie Fritsch stood in the doorway smiling benignly.
Oh hell,
said Walter.
Believe me, I didn't intend to interrupt.
Willie said happily.
But since we're all together right now, under such propitious circumstances, suppose we talk things over later,
said Walter. Ignoring his protest, Willie sat himself comfortably on the window seat, opened a large envelope, and took out the bound libretto of
Madame Butterfly.
He handed it to Maria without comment. She stared at it curiously but made no move to open it until Willie motioned her to do so. She nodded with recognition at the title page, then as she riffled through succeeding pages her expression changed from surprise to distaste. She tried to hand the libretto back to Willie, but instead of taking it he drew her to the window seat beside him and spoke to her as a father might speak to his daughter. By this time Walter could understand a little of what Willie was saying, and he could guess the rest of it. Maria's first reaction was to stare incredulously at Willie. As the full meaning of what he was asking became clear to her, she looked up at Walter. He saw scorn and anger in her dark eyes. When she looked back at Willie, it was to shake her head in emphatic refusal. Willie's tone became even more persuasive. He gazed out the window as he spoke down at the river pouring over the weir and ducking under the old stone bridge. Maria rolled the libretto into a tight scroll. Her fingers showed white through her unpolished nails. Willie stopped abruptly. He looked older, tired. Maria remained silent, her lips compressed into a tight line. At last she answered him in a voice that was tightly, coldly controlled. She stood up and walked toward the door. Walter held out his hand. She ignored it. He started after her, and Willie said,
Let her go.
Willie looked so depressed that Walter felt a need to comfort him.
It's all right.
He said.
We'll forget the whole idea.
Willie shook his head.
She'll do it.
He said wearily.
Oh.
She'll do it because she thinks she owes it to me.
Walter waited for the old maestro to continue.
As soon as we're through recording,
Willie went on, pushing himself up from the window seat.
Marisa wants to be released to another opera company. I'll go see her right now.
Walter began.
Not now.
Willie interrupted.
She wouldn't have anything to do with you. She thinks your only interest has been this recording.
Willie started rehearsals early the next morning in the big stone barn behind the inn. The structure's high roof and thick walls provided natural acoustics, while its location was far enough from Angolan to avoid creating undue curiosity. Recording equipment had been set up along one side. Around it the orchestra was grouped. The centre area was marked off for vocal rehearsals. Willie handled the direction himself, and not for a century had any director on earth undertaken such a staggering task. From the first moments of rehearsal it became evident that the orchestra could never hope to play an entire number in one sustained effort. It was not so much the physical effort involved as the difficulty of maintaining an emotional crest for so long a period. The first violinist fainted halfway through the opening sequence between Lieutenant Pinkerton and the American consul. This triggered a mass collapse among the woodwinds. The pianist wavered off an octave through sheer fatigue, and the drummer dropped his sticks when Willie cued him to step up tempo. Willie was frantic.
We'll have to record a few bars at a time until they're more accustomed to the strain,
he told Waller.
What an editing job this will be.
The problem with the vocalists was even more acute. Every duet would have to be recorded in at least 10 segments. Maria was the only one who stubbornly insisted on doing a complete number. It was a point of pride with her. She hated the music, it violated every principle she had ever learned. But the perfectionist in her, reinforced by her bitterness toward Walter and her sense of obligation to Willie, drove her to deliver the full measure of her promise. In the love duet between Butterfly and Pinkerton, which closed Act 1, the pale and perspiring Pinkerton was nearly spent as he began his final lines. Come then. Love, what fear holds you trembling? Have done with all misgivings. His impassioned plea quavered. He clutched Maria's arm to steady himself. Willie cut the music. For 5 minutes they held cold compresses to the singer's wrists while members of the orchestra slumped exhausted in their chairs. When all was somewhat recovered, Pinkerton attempted the next 2 lines of his wedding night rapture. The night doth in full dust. See the world lies sleeping. And then he had to rest again. But when Maria answered, her dark eyes flashing defiantly, she went through her entire 8 lines without a pause. Her great test came with the famous second act solo.
One fine day.
It was difficult enough to learn the strange words and music, but to achieve and hold the emotional peaks of the solo for nearly 2 minutes was something she had never before attempted. Because she insisted on doing the entire area without resting, Willie set the recording for early in the morning when the orchestra would be fresh. He asked them to assemble on the improvised sound stage an hour after breakfast. Willie limited the orchestra to a minimum tune-up period so that the musicians could conserve their energies for the ordeal ahead. The violins were the last to be ready. When the final string had been tuned, Willie cued the engineers to stand by and pointed the tip of his baton toward Maria.
Unbell die.
The words came clear as the notes of a silver bell calling back to life the beauty that had been dead for so long. Walter felt his stomach muscles tighten, a tingle of wonder crept up his spine. Standing there in the center of the old stone barn, wearing only sandals, shorts and a light blouse open at the neck, Maria still managed to convey the feelings of the lonely young Japanese wife who sang so confidently of her husband's return from across the sea. This was Maria, the incomparable artist, using all of her technique to blend the unfamiliar words and music. But for the first few lines it was only the technical tour de force. Then Puccini's music began to take hold of Maria, merging the artist with the woman and creating yet a third entity out of the two. He saw Willie turn transfixed toward Maria. His hands and baton continued to move, but not by conscious direction. His pink cheeks were pale, etched with deepening lines. His blue eyes were misted. Even the other members of the company seemed moved by Maria's performance. Yet they could not stay with her emotionally. They were compelled to break the tension by shuffling their feet and self-consciously lighting cigarettes. To a man, the orchestra played as if hypnotized, sweeping through measure after measure with an intensity that seemed impossible to maintain. For an uncertain moment near the end of the aria, it looked as if Maria could not finish. She swayed, held tightly to the microphone for support. Walter stepped forward to catch her, but she recovered, drawing on some inner source of strength to finish.
This will all come to pass, as I tell you.
Banish your idle fears, for he will return, I know it. As Maria finished, she tore herself away from the microphone. Her lips were trembling, her eyes were wide like those of a woman in shock. She half ran out of the barn, stopped confused in the bright sunlight, and then ran on down the path toward the inn. Until late afternoon Maria would see no one. Then she agreed to see Willie for a few moments. When the old maestro left her room, he looked deeply troubled.
I don't know.
He told Walter, shaking his head.
I don't know what this has done to her. What did she say? Right now, she says she will never sing again. She's going to her home in Italy this evening. Can we do anything? Looks like we've already done more than we should. Mixing two cultures in one artist is dangerous chemistry.
Up to this moment, Walter had deliberately avoided any decision about Maria. She had been a continuing and delightful challenge, especially since Tahiti, but beyond that he had not allowed his thoughts to go. Now there was a responsibility he could no longer evade. He had watched the dual personality that was Maria being shattered under the impact of Puccini's music. How would the pieces fit together again? Should he stand by and watch? Or should he try to help? And if he could help her, how would it all end? The gulf between two cultures could be wider than the mathematics of space between two galaxies or the bridging power of sex. Against Willie's advice, Walter decided to catch the same strut away with Maria and take his chances on what might happen. But a phone call from Uniport abruptly changed his plans. It was from their underworld contact, who informed Willie that the
Board of Directors
was meeting that evening. If Walter wanted to attend, he would have to take the next strut away to Uniport. Someone would meet him at the station. Uniport or Italy. Willie intervened to make the decision easier.
This will be your only chance to get into the vaults,
he counselled.
Besides, Maria must think some things through for herself.
His emotions in turmoil, Walter boarded the next strut away for Uniport. As North Wales and England blurred into the ocean beneath him, he had the feeling that he would never see the River Dee country again. A tall, thin young man with eyes as colourless as wax paper met him at the Uniport station and hurried him into a monorail car. Walter tentatively began a question, but the young man stopped him with an opaque stare. 4 times they changed monorail cars, ending up eventually at a freight terminal where an older man met them and pointed silently to one of the freight cars. Inside, Walter saw a strange assortment of smiling server robots and grim-faced humans sitting around on empty packing cases. The cases were already marked for shipment and transshipment throughout the galaxy. After quick, sharp glances of appraisal, no one paid any attention to him. He sat down beside one of the server robots and forced himself to wait as patiently as possible. For a half hour nothing happened. The server robots remained motionless. The humans chain smoked until the air in the freight car was an acrid grey smog. Nearly every human switched constantly and nervously from his tiny TV set to his watch radio. One of the men brought out a bottle, but quickly put it away after a staccato command from the graying, square-jawed man who seemed to be in charge. At 6 o'clock, without warning, the freight car vibrated slightly and began to move. The server robots stood up attentively. The humans snuffed out their cigarettes. Peering through one of the small windows, Walter saw that twilight was merging into night. It was completely dark when the car stopped at a loading platform behind the steel grey building that towered above the Uniport cultural vaults. A server robot guard stepped forward challengingly. At a gesture from the leader, one of the server robots within the car marched out on the platform and presented a punched bill of lading. As the guard fed the document into its tabulator, the other stepped closer and lightly brushed against it. The guard stiffened as though from a severe shock. There was a sound like that of a racing motor suddenly thrown out of gear. Then a click and silence. The server robot guard unhinged itself at the knees and collapsed on the platform. Another signal from the leader, and out of the car scurried the humans and server robots. They ran across the platform toward the shadow of the building. Here 2 of the men who Walter guessed to be the experts imported to Earth for this job traced a circle around the door with an instrument that resembled a small camera. Evidently this was to cut off the alarm system, for almost immediately they relaxed and went on to open the door without any attempt at caution. Proceeding in single file, lighting their way with powerful flashlights, they passed in similar manner through a series of inner doors to an elevator leading down into the vaults. A server robot took over its operation and they shot downward. At each level, the leader stepped off the elevator to look around. At the 6th level he nodded and they followed him into the vault. This was a book vault. Tier upon tier the stacks of books reached in every direction as far as a flashlight beam could probe. Motioning Walder to follow him, the leader took a piece of chalk and began marking off groups of books. The men rounded up library carts for the server robots, who swiftly fell to loading the carts and trundling them back to the elevator. Walder soon moved ahead of the leader and began marking the books himself. They had started in the end sections. With mounting excitement, Walder chalked off Machiavelli, Man, Markham, Masefield, Moore and Maupassant, Melville, Millet, Molière. Leaping to the next tier, he raced through the stacks marking the works of Nathan and Newton, O'Neill, Ovid, then onto Parker, Pater, Pepys, Plato, Poe, Racine, Rousseau, Sandberg, Santana. What an astounding haul this would be! The masterpieces of the ages to be whisked across space from star system to star system until at last they reached his homeland, where they would grow and multiply a millionfold generation into generation down through the millenniums of universal time. Back to the A sections. Adams, Aeschylus, Anderson, Aristotle. On to the B sections. Bacon, Balzac, Bennett, Bron, Byron. It was like drinking a heady burgundy. Each new title whetted his taste for more. Inevitably, the very magnitude of the thing began to have its sobering effect. Was it actually possible to get so much material out of the vaults? Off the earth. The leader caught up with him in the K sections and motioned him not to mark off any more books. They'd have a hard time getting those Walder had already chalked. Walder rode up with the next elevator load. On the way down, he indicated to the server robot that he wanted to go all the way to the bottom level. There he stepped out of the elevator and stood in the darkness for a moment to steady himself from the excitement of marking so many books. Then he swept his flashlight beam slowly around the vault. It was like turning on a light in a tomb that had been sealed for centuries. Certainly this tomb had been sealed to all except the digesters and the server robot attendants. The vault was at least 200 feet high. Walder could only guess at the other dimensions and the extent of the corridors that fanned out like the spokes of a wheel. Sculptured figures from all the ages of Earth loomed out of the shadows with the quality of arrested life that might at any moment move again. The figures of the pharaohs were here, the chiseled perfection of Athens and Rome, the genius of the Renaissance and the primitive gods of the Aztecs. The armless Venus gazed down dispassionately on the bowed back of the discus thrower, while Rodin's thinker stared in eternal contemplation at the belly of Buddha. And then Walder looked up with it. High overhead, reassembled on a great oblong span of artificial ceiling suspended from the top of the vault, were the 9 immortal panels from the Sistine Chapel. Tracing his beam of light through scene by scene of Michelangelo's creation of the world, lingering among the connective figures of the prophets, then sibyls, the lunettes, then triangles, Walder lost all sense of time. When his back and neck muscles could stand the strain no longer, he wandered deeper into the dim recesses of the vault, following corridor after corridor entranced. He was like a condemned man watching his last sunrise and trying to absorb it all, knowing he would not come this way again. Walder did not realize how far he had wandered until he came at last to the end of a corridor and glanced at his watch. 10 o'clock. He'd been gone from the group for nearly 3 hours, and the entire raid had been timed for 2 hours. He started running for the elevator. Corridor led into corridor, gallery into gallery. It took him 20 minutes to find his way back to the main vault, another 5 minutes to locate the right elevator. He pressed the button and listened. There was no sound within the shaft. He shouted, and there was only the echo of his own voice reverberating through the ages around him. Fighting down a flutter of panic, Walder turned off his light and leaned against the elevator door to organize his thoughts. He was sure the others had left on time to make shipment schedules at the Uniport landing. They might have delayed long enough to make a cursory search for him, but his safety was no part of their commitment. They had successfully raided the vaults, which was all they had contracted to do. Before morning, most of them undoubtedly would have embarked on interplanetary cruises. Walder's first decision was to try the other elevators on the off chance that one had been left in operating gear. None had. Next, he set off to look for a stairwell, fire ladder, or other method of exit. It took him 3 hours to cover the entire vault and its corridors. No doubt of it, the elevators were the only means of entering and leaving. It was now 1 o'clock. In 8 hours the upper level doors would open to the digesters. No particular effort had been made to camouflage the gaps in the stacks. His one chance was to reach the street level before anyone noticed the missing books. Meanwhile, he could do nothing except spend the night as comfortably as possible. He spread his coat on the marble floor behind the squat statue of a Malayan goddess. Surprisingly, he did doze off toward morning. He awoke shortly after 8 o'clock and began to punch the elevator button every 5 minutes. Finally, at 3 minutes to 9, the faint hum responded within the shaft. He retreated hastily into the nearest corridor and waited another 10 minutes before bringing the elevator down to his level. Then he entered it, pressed the street level control and shot upward. He lit a cigarette and was prepared to step out nonchalantly as soon as the door opened. His exit was nonchalant enough, but the server robot guard in front of the elevator held out its tabulator slot and said,
"CRDPLS."
Walter was shaken but did not freeze up. He fumbled in his pocket for a slip of paper and tried to cram it into the tabulator. A red light flashed on the server robot's chest. A buzzer sounded. 30 yards beyond, Walter saw the front desk and the door opened to the street. He acted with the impulse. A sidestep took him around the server robot, and then he was racing toward the door. 3 steps later, a vise-like grip clamped around his shoulders and swept him off his feet. Twisting, he saw that the server robot's arm had elongated and that the fingers had stretched to encircle his body. He kicked hard at the arm, and that was his last conscious act. The next time Walter opened his eyes, his head throbbed so violently he closed them again. When the spinning stopped, he tried once more. Around him he saw 4 metallic walls, and overhead a ceiling of similar material. Except for a ventilator grid and the outlines of 2 doors, there were no breaks in the wall and no decorations. He was lying on a low, narrow cot and was still fully dressed. He felt his head. There was a large lump above his right temple where he might have struck the floor. But he was still too groggy for much speculation. He closed his eyes to ease the throbbing and fell into an uneasy sleep. The creaking of the door must have roused him, for it was closing as he focused on it. A tray of food was within arm's reach. A smaller door behind his bed had been opened that led to a tiny washroom. After freshening up and trying the food, Walter felt much better. He was a strong-nerved young man not accustomed to worry, and he tried to weigh the facts for and against him. If the shipments had gone off without a hitch, things might not be so bad. He'd been found leaving the vault, but no one would suppose that he'd have stayed around after somehow disposing of the books. They might suspect him, but it would be hard to disprove his story that he'd taken the elevator by mistake the day before and been trucked overnight. Anyway, as a visitor from another galaxy, he was entitled to certain consideration. He felt even better when the door opened late in the afternoon to admit Willie Fritsch and a tight-lipped man of about 40.
Your lawyer,
said Willie. He looked and sounded grim. After completing introductions, Willie told him that he was indeed accused of the theft and would be arraigned in the morning.
They can't prove it.
Walter answered calmly.
They think they can. Our digestive friend, remember our bohemian evening, has come forward to accuse you. He'll testify about the offer we made him. Will he accuse you too? Not exactly. I am supposed to be an innocent bystander. A friend who was used.
In spite of the circumstances, the hint of the old sparkle returned to Willie's eyes, and he smiled faintly.
What can they do about it?
Waller demanded. After all, he was a von Königsberg. Willie's smile vanished.
Our legal friend here says 10 years would be a light sentence.
They discussed the case for an hour while the lawyer took meticulous notes. Then, through Willie, the attorney began questioning Walter about his financial status. Even in the language of consonants, his voice was suave. The lawyer's precise little symbols wavered as Walder briefly outlined his family circumstances, but a server robot opened the door before further questions could be asked. Willie started to shake hands with Walder, then impulsively put his arms around him. There were tears in the corners of his blue eyes. He tried to say something, but gave it up and hurried out the door behind the attorney.
Wait.
Walder called after him.
Have you heard anything from Maria?
Willie sadly shook his head.
No. Nothing.
Walder had scarcely finished breakfast next morning when a server robot came to take him to court. The robot linked thumb and forefinger around Walder's wrist with a grip or handcuff. There were no spectators in the courtroom, perhaps Walder thought glumly, because it was a free attraction that would interfere with the consumption of happy time entertainment. Willie joined him at the defendant's table.
Still the loyal, misguided friend.
Willie murmured.
I volunteered to be your interpreter.
The judge was a human, but all clerks and bailiffs were server robots. As soon as the court was gavelled into session, the prosecutor presented a 20-second digest of the case against Walder and called the little digester as a substantiating witness. Walder didn't need any translation to understand what the witness was saying. Shifting unhappily in his chair and avoiding Willie's eyes, the little digester answered preliminary questions in a scarcely audible voice. But when he pointed his finger at Walder, his voice became shrill and he reddened to the top of his bald head.
Now he'll be afraid to attend one of our meetings.
Willie murmured.
That's what he's really blaming you for.
When the digester left the stand, a portly man with a perpetual tic in his left cheek arose to address the court. He was at the prosecutor's table and until this moment had seemed to take very little interest in the proceedings. But now he spoke in a steel-edged voice that was in surprising contrast to his slow, heavy movements.
He's speaking as a friend of the court.
Willie whispered.
His office is legal representative of the Happy Time cartel in Uniport.
He's telling the court what a terrible offence you committed, but is willing in the public interest not to press charges if you'll return the books at once. Otherwise, he demands you be held for trial without bail.
Walder's lawyer conferred briefly with Willie. The judge and prosecutor also conferred and both spoke with obvious deference to the Happy Time attorney. With the bow to all three, Walder's lawyer addressed the court. His smooth voice rippled lightly over the harsh consonants and his thin lips parted often in a swift, mirthless smile. He spoke for almost a minute and the judge began to toy with his gavel, watching the Happy Time attorney for a cue to his feelings. The attorney had slumped back in his chair, eyes drooping, but the tic in his cheek worked furiously. Then Walder's lawyer turned toward the Happy Time lawyer and paused dramatically.
He's talking about your family.
Willie whispered again.
I think he's exaggerating a bit, but he says they own an entire planet twice the size of Earth.
When the lawyer continued, the smoothness was come from his voice. His words came hard, crisp, brief. The elderly judge sagged back in his chair, the prosecutor blinked, and the Happy Time attorney allowed his eyes to close completely.
I hope you approve.
Willie said in a shaky whisper.
You've just offered to deposit 100 million credits with the Happy Time cartel as assurance the books will be returned. What? I don't even admit taking them. Neither does your lawyer. But, as he puts it, if anyone acting in your behalf, but without your direct knowledge, should have seized these books and shipped them off the earth, you will assume responsibility for their return. Otherwise, they may be turned loose among the people of Earth to plant seeds of future trouble.
Walder's lawyer emphasized one brief phrase and sat down. Even Walder recognized the words 100 million credits. The Happy Time attorney slowly opened his eyes and heaved himself to his feet. He spread out both pudgy hands to the judge and shrugged his bulging shoulders. He spoke briefly and the steel edge was gone from his voice.
He suggests that the court in its wisdom temper justice with mercy.
Willie translated excitedly. After this it was a matter of detail, with the prosecutor insisting only that Walder be kept in custody and deported immediately after the deposit had been arranged. The strain of the whole affair had been too much for Willie, but as the smiling server robot led Walder out of the courtroom, he called after him,
I'll be at the landing.
Walder knew he should be happy. He had found what he wanted on Earth. Not in the way he had hoped, but the final reckoning was the same. Still, there was an emptiness to it all, an emptiness and an aching. When he cleared customs and was released by his server robot guard, Walter saw Willie Fritsch waiting beside the Singus Roman 3 shuttle ship. A half-dozen of his musicians were with him. Willie said with simple directness,
"If you want us, we'd like to go with you."
Of all the things that had happened to him in the last 24 hours, this took Wall the most completely by surprise. He stared speechless from Willie to the musicians, most of them older men.
These few came to me.
Willie said,
They don't want to go back to our own music, neither do I.
His voice broke and he continued pleading.
"We can help bring your dream to life in the few years left us."
Waldo enveloped the old maestro in a bear hug that crushed the breath out of him.
Want yees?
He cried.
Now who's a fool?
"You are."
Gasped Willie.
"If you thought I'd leave part of my heart behind."
Waldo looked around quickly. At the top of the shuttle ship ramp stood a young woman with half a smile and half a question on her lips. There was doubt in that smile and fear. There was loneliness and wonder and hope. It was a promise and a warning of all that lay ahead for them out there beyond the stars. Humbly more knowing that he had yet been in his short life, Waldo held out his hands and walked up the ramp toward her, toward a dream that was over and a reality that could be more bitter, more sweet than any dream. I hope you enjoyed reading the book Abbr with me. If you liked this, please remember to like and subscribe. Please visit @Autonomy if you want to see different types of videos we produce. For statistics on our videos, visit @Autonomy Core. Happy YouTube travels.